Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm Tavia Gilbert, and in this podcast, we have ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin, who is here to talk to us today about threats to critical infrastructure, Internet as utility. One category of threats the ISF has watched for a long time are threats to infrastructure and critical systems like the banking systems and the electrical grids. In the latest ISF Threat Horizon report, Threat Horizon 2019, disruption of the Internet is a key theme. Steve, what exactly does the ISF mean when it suggests that there will be a disruption from an over-reliance on over-fragile Internet connectivity? Why does this threat matter so much?
I think one of the things that we've noticed, Tavia, over the past few years is this increasing dependence on the Internet. It doesn't actually matter whether you happen to be an individual or whether you're an organisation. We have come to view the Internet as a basic utility. Let's think about basic utilities. When we talk about a basic utility, we're probably referring to things like water, electricity. If we think about the way in which we use those utilities, we turn on the tap, we expect it to be there. We plug into the socket and we expect power to suddenly come out. If it doesn't work, that causes us a problem, one that we actually don't anticipate, and so one that we very rarely plan for. The Internet has become just like that. So it is something that we expect to be there, whether we're accessing it from our offices, whether we're accessing it on the move over perhaps a mobile network, through free Wi-Fi in a hotel or whatever it might be. And so we rarely tend to plan for the day when it isn't there. And therein lies the problem. So this dependence that we have on the Internet is, I think, for a lot of organisations becoming a particular threat that they need to think through and manage from a response standpoint. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you happen, for instance, to be an organisation that is entirely dependent upon sharing information with third parties to conduct your business, you could be a trader of some sort, you could be in the financial services space, doesn't actually really matter. That infrastructure is what you depend on to go about doing your business. If it is no longer there, what is the impact that that will have on your ability to transact? For a lot of organisations, it will mean that you stop doing business. Have you planned for that? Have you looked at the implications of that? Do you know what you might do to get around that? And when I talk about this, people often say to me, well, we can't replace the Internet. We're not going to create our own. No, we can't do that. But I think it's important for us to understand what our reliance is from a business standpoint on Internet connectivity, to look at the steps we might take in the instance where it isn't available, and to plan for those and to introduce into our incident management programs that kind of response. And it may well be that we have to revert to downtime in our processes. Well, let's build those in, for instance. What would the impact of that be? What would the cost associated with that be? It may well be that we have to look at the way in which we can do all that we can to ensure that we can still gain access to the Internet. I'm thinking perhaps of taking out personal lines, for instance, to create virtual private networks so that you can access an Internet that is perhaps outside of your own specific area, should the access go down on a regionalised or specific business level. But also from a government standpoint, the Internet is considered to be, I think, part of our critical national infrastructure. And so what is the impact of that in terms of it being taken down? And then we get into the realm of, well, how do we protect it? We have seen, for instance, different examples of Internet being very deliberately taken down. I'm thinking in particular here of a number of years ago of what Russia did to Estonia, for instance, of actually cutting off all Internet access for a variety of reasons. The Estonian response to that these days has been to spread its information in a number of different centres around the world so that it has backups in place that it might be able to then access when it gets back up and running. So the very fact that that country had its Internet access completely destroyed for a period of time has moved them to a place of saying, what do we need to do in order to ensure that we're still able to transact business as a country going forward, to preserve the information that we necessarily need going forward. And I think that organisations should really be taking a similar approach of applying that rationale to the way in which they are dependent upon the internet. And the good news is that most organisations know how to do it, because for years we have looked at business continuity planning on the assumption that either our mainframe centres might fail or we might not have electricity. So we would have a separate site, we would have a generator and these sorts of things. So I think that given the importance of internet to businesses, it's becoming increasingly more important that we include the lack of it in our business continuity and incident management planning.
Just the idea of being without the internet makes me not want to think about it. So I'm sure that businesses have that same idea. It's overwhelming, but so vital to have that plan. In talking about those internet networks over which businesses actually run, over which trade and commerce depend, to what extent is their connectivity threatened?
I think we have seen, certainly in some of the emerging economies around the world, over the last 12 to 18 months, a number of internet outages that certainly have translated into very real dollar impact. Now, those outages have come about in some instances because of poorly designed technology or simple failures in technology. But I think there is also an emerging concern around what would happen if there was a nation-state threat actor that decided to take out the internet for whatever purpose, and how do we plan for that? So again, I think as with most things related to cybersecurity these days, it does depend on the different elements that we're looking at. So from an organisational standpoint, I think we have to assure ourselves that we're doing as much as we can within our control. When we look at it much more from, say, a critical infrastructure standpoint, then I think there is a role for government to be playing in that as well, in terms of providing input. And inevitably, of course, all of these things place more and more of a burden on law enforcement to really try to track down and anticipate where some of these attacks could potentially be coming. So the importance of intelligence gathering in all of these different areas as well takes on a different perspective, I think, when we get into looking at some of these issues.
In terms of the threat to critical infrastructure, what is the alternative? If a company can no longer rely on the internet for its business systems and services, what is to be done?
I think for a lot of organisations, the reality is that there's not a lot they can do. And that, I think, is a pretty stark statement. So I think that if we try to look at that from a slightly more positive perspective.
Save us. We've just sunk into deep depression here.
I think what we do need to be doing, as I've said, is looking at what the impact of that might be. What could we use around that? So, for instance, do we want to have backups that take us back to the age of telex, for instance? Mm-hmm. I can think of some industry sectors that have probably only just emerged from that, and here I am suggesting they might want to go back to it. But I think that it will depend on each individual organisation to assess the importance of that internet access, and really I think to assess the maximum and minimum periods that they can work without it, and explore different ways in which they might be able then to overcome the challenge of a lack of internet access. So maybe we would, for instance, revert to hard copy in terms of USBs and so on for the transferring of information. Let's look at some of that and consider how we might go about doing that. Then the question comes in: well, what is a reasonable amount of downtime that you might expect from these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, are we talking hours, weeks, months? What?
And that's the unknown, of course. Certainly, if you go back to my standard utility analogy, I think that there are useful comparisons that can be drawn there. What is the maximum downtime that you could expect if you're a hospital to be able to maintain basic coverage if your electricity suddenly goes or your generators fail? It would be very different in that environment, for instance, from, say, somebody who happens to be a retailer. So we get into all of these different elements of, is it a matter of life or death, or is it just a commercial inconvenience? The only people who can answer those questions are the individual organisations themselves. It needs to consider its dependence on internet from a communication standpoint and from a transactional perspective. It needs to assess the risk appetite within the enterprise to understand what risk an organisation is prepared to take. It may well be for some that the sheer cost of trying to work around what we're talking about is prohibitive. And actually, because if they didn't have internet access, it would be equally as damaging for their competitors or other organisations, that it's something that they're willing to accept on that basis. It's something that is probably outside the control of most organisations. So the ability to control in this space is very, very limited.
Well, it's interesting to me, too, that I'm hearing not only do business leaders need to be forward-looking and adopt new technologies and be on the leading edge of where our world is going, we also need to stay in touch with old technology that can help us carry through. You're talking about USBs, and the way to be secure is not to forget everything that we've known and learned along the way, and not to let everything go that we've employed along the way, but to keep those elements of more of older technology at hand because they continue to be useful.
Yeah, I think there's always a danger, isn't there, to chuck yourself into the latest new piece of technology because of the benefits that it brings. And I think that's fair. You certainly don't want to get left behind in these spaces. But at the same time, I think that increasingly we need to be looking at alternatives. We need to be planning for the day when perhaps the technology isn't working, when perhaps we're not able to transact business in the way that we would normally have done. And then it would make sense perhaps to revert to something that is perhaps a little bit more old-fashioned.
Steve, you're full of surprises. I never quite know what to expect when we talk, because that's not where I thought the conversation would go. But I think that's really fascinating and will be of interest to people who are equally surprised. Thanks for elaborating on just how hyper-connected the world is and talking about the extent to which businesses rely on the internet. It sounds like even the temporary loss of the internet infrastructure would bring disruption and chaos to businesses and to individuals. And it's crucial to have the right controls in place and be coordinate on all critical infrastructure programs. For more information on the ISF's Threat Horizon 2019 report, which discusses the disruption of the internet as an emerging threat, please visit securityforum.org.